The origin of the crime. Death in the isolated forest. It was a blustery winter evening in December 1998, and the town of Fox Hollow was wrapping itself in snow blankets under a dark, eerie sky. Nestled on the outskirts of Maine, this quiet town was no stranger to harsh winters and isolated woods, but on that night a phone call to the local sheriff's department would shatter the town's peace. "There's smoke, thick black smoke, rising near Red Cliff Trail," came the shaky voice of a man who frequently hiked the area. "It ain't no campfire, someone better come quick." Deputy Marshal Richard "Rich" Harris, a man of few words but plenty of grit, responded to the scene with two patrol officers. As they rumbled down the narrow gravel path leading to the trail, the headlamps of their cruiser barely penetrated the dense fog and swirling snow. "It's a cold one tonight," Officer Mills muttered, clenching his gloved hands together. But when the flickering orange glow came into view, the air in the car turned icy for reasons unrelated to the temperature. The fire, centralized within the remote Red Cliff trailhead of Fox Hollow's forest land, was no typical winter's blaze. The flames ate hungrily at what appeared to be a crude pile of twigs and logs, stacked unnaturally near the base of a towering fir tree. However, there was something unmistakably human within the fire, charred, darkened, and distorted beyond immediate recognition. Harris stalled for a brief moment, taking an unsteady breath before ordering, "Get the extinguishers. Now." As the flames diminished under a frothy spray of chemical extinguishers, what remained became more horrifying with every second. Beneath the blackened logs was the mangled body of a young woman, burned so extensively that her features had been erased by the fire's ruthlessness. Her frame lay unnaturally limbless, with hands bound tightly behind her back, though the ropes had partially disintegrated. With no clothing or belongings nearby to give identification, she looked less like a person and more like a grim apparition of a crime cruelly executed. "I'll be damned," whispered Officer Mills, stepping back in disbelief. Harris crouched down, examining the scene closely. "No wallet, no shoes. Looks like someone went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make this body disappear." Yet, the eerie perfection of the crime, down to a lack of struggle marks, suggested this was no spur-of-the-moment act. Whoever had done this knew the forest well, knew this particular trail was seldom used in winter, and certainly had a massive amount of malice, or maybe desperation, in their heart. Harris gritted his teeth and muttered under his breath, "This is no accident. We've got ourselves a murder here, boys." Other odd traces littered the scene. A shovel half buried in the frosted earth lay a few yards away, with dirt still crumbling near its edge. Nearby, faint footprints in the snow, likely altered by the heat of the fire, led toward a dense patch of trees. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the frigid air. Someone had been meticulous, yet hurried. The fire seemed meant to obliterate something, but it hadn't been carefully tended to last long enough. By the time the forensics team arrived from Augusta 2 hours later, snow began to blanket the forest once again. The team's initial analysis confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. The victim, a young woman, had likely been killed before her body was brought here and burned. The burns were too even to indicate she had died within the flames. No signs of inhalation of smoke were present in the remaining portions of her lungs. What kind of monster carries a premeditated body dump like this? From there, the mystery began to spin beyond the control of the Fox Hollow Police Department. No missing person case from the area immediately matched the victim's incomplete profile. The meticulousness combined with brutality suggested someone with anger, but also a dangerously cool head. As one investigator noted, they wanted her erased, not just from the earth, but from any possibility of being identified at all. The first night of what later would be dubbed the Melissa Miller case revolved around these grim discoveries. The news spread quickly, disturbing the otherwise uneventful holiday season in Fox Hollow. For locals, the idea that something so horrifying could happen in their secluded corner of America was almost impossible to believe. The town's veneer of tranquility had shattered. In the weeks to come, locals would hear whispers about strangers lurking in the woods, shadowy figures seen out of car windows, and old secrets of the haunted forest. But for Sheriff Harris, it wasn't folklore or paranoia that worried him. It was the cold, hard fact. A young woman had been murdered and burned, and whoever did this was out there, possibly planning their next move. "These woods may be quiet," Harris said to his team as they packed up for the evening, "but tonight, they sure as hell aren't innocent." The victim's identity, and the secrets of her life. In the days following the grim discovery in the forest, the Fox Hollow Police Department poured their efforts into identifying the victim. Without a purse, Idaho, or any distinguishing jewelry left intact, the task seemed monumental. The only object recovered intact from the inferno was a single silver ring, badly tarnished but legible enough to make out an engraving, "To MM, forever yours." This clue, though minor, proved pivotal. The initials were a breadcrumb that led investigators to Melissa Miller, a young woman who had been reported missing by her roommate in the nearby college town of Brunswick just 2 days before. Melissa Miller, as it turned out, was no ordinary citizen of Fox Hollow. She had moved to Maine 2 years prior to attend the University of Northern Maine, where she was pursuing a degree in environmental science. At just 22, Melissa was a reserved yet driven individual. Her professors described her as a thoughtful young woman with a strong passion for conservation efforts, often channeling her energy into small, solitary field research projects. However, her introverted demeanor made her difficult to know well, and those around her only caught glimpses of her private life. She kept to herself, one professor commented, but she always had this air of inner determination, like she was searching for something she couldn't quite find. As investigators dug deeper into Melissa's life, they came to learn of her quiet but peculiar routines. She spent most of her weekends exploring remote parts of Maine, places where most people wouldn't bother venturing in winter. A lover of solitude and nature, Melissa's roommates recalled her often vanishing for hours at a time with just her old Subaru, a camera, and notebooks filled with drawings of local wildlife. She was known to frequent the areas surrounding Fox Hollow, particularly a path near Red Cliff Trail where her body had been found. To people in town, she was that quiet, mysterious girl, always polite but never overfamiliar, yet something about these habits felt strange, particularly in a part of the state where isolation wasn't just a habit, it was a way to disappear entirely. Melissa's family painted a slightly different picture of her. Her parents, Susan and Tom Miller, traveled from New York to help identify the body, and their testimonies added more layers to her enigmatic persona. According to Susan, her daughter had always been an introspective child, bookish, empathetic, and more comfortable in the company of animals than people. She always loved the woods, Susan recalled tearfully during her interview. Even when she was a child, Melissa could spend hours wandering through parks, picking up stones or leaves, studying them like little treasures. But as adolescence crept in, so did a palpable sense of detachment. Melissa wasn't lonely per se, but solitary. She had friends, Susan said, but there were always parts of Melissa that she never let anyone into. It was like she had a secret, and she'd rather hold on to that than share it with the world. This veil of secrecy extended into her adult life. In going through her personal belongings, police uncovered an assortment of peculiar items that hinted at yet another side of Melissa Miller. A locked diary, a disposable cell phone apart from her main one, and handwritten letters addressed to no one in particular, many with cryptic phrases like, "The past wears many faces," and "Silence soothes only those who choose it." A single name stood out across these notes: a Danny. With no last name or further context, it was unclear who he was or what he meant to Melissa, but it became instantly clear to the detectives that Melissa might not have been as simple as she seemed. Then came the discovery that truly broke the case wide open. Melissa's private life wasn't just about isolation or love for nature. The police eventually compiled records of her financial transactions that posed some troubling questions. Over 6 months, Melissa had made deposits into an unknown bank account every other week, each time with odd round-numbered sums like 1, 500 or 1, 500 or 2, 0, 0, 0. Her income as a student researcher didn't even begin to explain where this money was coming from or why she was transferring it elsewhere. Moreover, her text records, once unlocked from her phone, revealed conversations she never shared with her close friends or family. Messages written to someone under the username Hawk, cryptic in tone but intense in content, read like an exchange between someone desperate for guidance and another person with veiled authority. "It's almost done," one text read. "You promised once it was, I could leave." So, what exactly was she involved in? Sergeant Harris muttered as they sifted through her phone logs. This question sat heavily over everyone working the case. Then came even more bewildering revelations. Melissa seemed to have ties with a mysterious, older man named Daniel Carter. Daniel, a reclusive but highly influential businessman in Fox Hollow, owned a large estate tucked in the far eastern part of town. Melissa had frequently been spotted driving onto Carter's property late at night, though no one ever saw her staying long. As friends and classmates were questioned, the pieces slowly began fitting together, though strangely, only on the edges. Some claimed Melissa had started acting more distracted in recent months, even paranoid. One classmate, reluctant to share at first, admitted, "She once told me to be careful who I trust around here, but when I asked what she meant, she clammed up." Perhaps the most haunting detail of all came from Melissa's roommate, who revealed a chilling conversation not long before her disappearance. "Melissa, she told me she felt like someone was following her," the roommate said, "but then she just shrugged it off and said she was being silly. She even joked like, what would they want with someone like me?" But now, tears welled up in her eyes as she added, "I should have listened more. I should have pushed her to tell me what was going on." By now, investigators had painted a murky portrait of Melissa Miller, a quiet, introspective environmentalist on the surface, but beneath that, a young woman carrying the weight of something unspoken. The question remained, what were the secrets she had taken to the grave, and more importantly, who else knew them? For one thing was certain, this wasn't a random killing. Melissa wasn't just a victim of cruel happenstance. Someone had wanted to erase her from the world completely, and their reasons were likely as complex and haunting as she was. Melissa and the connection to the quiet town. For as long as anyone could remember, Fox Hollow had been the kind of town where strangers lingered for just a moment before moving on, or never arrived at all. Tucked away near the wilderness of Maine, the town was more a collection of memories than a thriving locale. Its streets were lined with quaint, fading storefronts, an aging diner where the sheriff often sat for coffee, and a post office that doubled as the town's source of gossip. Yet, for its anonymity and charm, Fox Hollow carried with it an eerie stillness, a quiet that was less comforting and more unsettling during the colder months, when the screech of the wind through the barren pines could easily sound like a scream. Melissa Miller had no apparent reason to care about a place like Fox Hollow, but the young environmentalist found herself inexplicably drawn to it. From the moment she'd arrived in Maine for college, it had become clear she wasn't just interested in studying nature. She wanted to immerse herself in it, connect to it in ways that most of her peers found peculiar. One by one, she pushed the boundaries of where she ventured. While her classmates stuck to bustling tourist sites and scenic trails that promised postcard-worthy views, Melissa ventured beyond. By the time she discovered Fox Hollow, she had already mapped out every inch of the surrounding woods, the abandoned quarries and the overgrown remnants of forgotten logging mills. She loved being where no one else would bother to go, her roommate Claire recounted. "I guess Fox Hollow made sense because, well, it didn't seem like anyone wanted to go there either." Melissa's relationship with Fox Hollow wasn't entirely organic though. Locals couldn't help but notice her sporadic appearances in town, particularly when her weathered Subaru Outback would be seen darting past the diner, heading toward the old Red Cliff Trail parking lot. Most assumed she was another of those tree huggers who found comfort in Maine's rugged landscapes. But others, like Marge Porter who manned the cash register at the local general store, recalled Melissa with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She was polite, always polite, but she wasn't, chatty, Marge told reporters later. She'd come in, buy something odd, rope one time, gas cans another, and she'd pay in cash, always exact change. I guess a part of me thought, that's weird for a college girl. But, well, we don't see many young people around here anymore, so we don't ask a lot of questions. It wasn't just her purchasing habits that felt off to the locals, it was the way she carried herself, distant, almost haunted. Melissa was never rude, but she gave off an air of guardedness that made even the most neighborly Fox Hollow residents hesitant to engage her for too long. Her curiosity about Fox Hollow wasn't limited to its terrain either. Detectives uncovered that Melissa spent time poring over historical records from the town library, one that hadn't seen more than 10 visitors in a week since the late 80s. She seemed particularly interested in digging into incidents involving the old Red Cliff Trail area, especially in relation to the now shuttered Greystone mines. The mines had once been the heart and livelihood of Fox Hollow, until an industrial accident in the early 1970s led to their closure. After that, many residents moved away, leaving behind only whispers of tragedies and rumors regarding what truly happened during those final days of the mine's operation. But why did Melissa care? Why had an out-of-towner become so fixated on Fox Hollow's long-buried stories? These questions became all the more pressing as the police learned more about her peculiar relationship with certain residents of the town. Most notable was Daniel Carter, a wealthy reclusive landowner whose vast wilderness property bordered the eastern edge of Fox Hollow. Daniel wasn't the typical small-town figure. In fact, most of the town had never interacted with him directly. He seemed otherworldly, a man of power, money, and secrets. When Melissa's connection to Carter was unearthed, the case turned darker. Melissa had been spotted several times driving her Subaru onto Daniel's sprawling estate, often late at night. "Nobody goes to see Carter unless they've got something to gain, or something to lose," remarked one of the town's older residents. What exactly had brought Melissa to his doorstep remained a mystery, but suspicions ran wild. Some believed she was working for him, perhaps cataloging the rare plant species or surveying the land for conservation efforts. Others were convinced her visits were less professional and more personal. Either way, it became clearer that Carter held an influence over Melissa that no one else seemed to understand. The more detectives peeled away the layers of Melissa's time in Fox Hollow, the more questions surfaced. What had she seen in those woods? Was her interest in the town part of her studies, or because of something more sinister? One chilling theory arose when it was discovered she had been taking photographs of abandoned cabins and structures deep within the forest. These weren't places the average hiker would stumble upon. They were deliberately hidden, tucked away from any well-trodden paths. Her journal, recovered from the Subaru, had notes like "suspicious movement, 3 a.m., north of Red Cliff," and "black smoke behind East Ridge," scrawled in frantic handwriting. Fox Hollow wasn't the type of place to trust outsiders. Melissa's behavior only further alienated her from its aging, tight-knit community. It didn't help that she often asked questions that seemed a little too specific, about missing persons cases, about land disputes in the town's earlier history, and about certain individuals who had left mysteriously after the mines closed. Sheriff Rich Harris reflected later, "She was connecting dots no one wanted to connect because, quite frankly, we wanted to move on. But sometimes a stranger comes along and stirs the pot." If Melissa had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to, the people of Fox Hollow were in no rush to admit it. "She had no reason to be looking into any of that stuff," said one old-timer at the diner, shaking his head grimly. But Melissa evidently felt otherwise. The more she uncovered, the deeper her ties to Fox Hollow became, ties that would ultimately prove deadly. Witness testimony. Strangers in the woods. The early stages of the Melissa Miller investigation were marked by limited evidence and a growing list of unanswered questions. However, a breakthrough emerged from a local resident, someone whose ordinary day had taken a chilling turn. Margaret "Maggie" Reynolds, the manager of a small convenience store on the edge of Fox Hollow, walked into the police station 3 days after the body was discovered. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse tightly against her chest. She asked quietly, "Are you the ones investigating that fire? The one in the woods?" Sheriff Rich Harris, always patient but firm, nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Sheriff Harris. Do you have something to report?" Maggie set her purse on her lap and exhaled deeply before speaking. "I don't know if it's important. Maybe it's nothing, but I feel like I need to say something just in case." Harris gestured for her to continue. "Take your time. What did you see?" Maggie looked past him for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the frosty window of the station, as if she was putting the pieces together in her mind. "It was the day before they found her," she began. "Melissa, I didn't know her name at the time. She came into my store earlier that morning." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Melissa? Are you sure it was her?" "Yes, I'm sure," she said firmly. "I've seen her a few times before. Always coming through town, always quiet. She had this old Subaru Outback, beat-up little thing. She didn't talk much, but, polite. She'd buy hiking supplies, snacks, water, that sort of thing. That morning, though, she wasn't alone." This immediately caught Harris's attention. "Tell me more about that. Who was she with?" Maggie's fingers fidgeted with the straps of her purse. "It was a man, mid-40s, maybe older, tall, kind of lanky with this, sharp look about him. He had one of those faces you don't forget, thin lips, high cheekbones. His hair was dark but graying at the temples. And his eyes," she hesitated, then added, "they were cold. I get a lot of hikers and tourists passing through, but this guy wasn't like them." Harris scribbled in his notepad. "A tall, older man. Did they seem familiar with each other?" "At first I couldn't tell. They didn't look like friends. He kind of stood back while she shopped. Didn't say much to her, just watched her from across the store. She bought a coil of rope, a can of gasoline, and, one of those cheap camping tarps we sell out back. Nothing out of the ordinary for a hiker, but—" Maggie stopped, her eyes suddenly darting toward Harris. "She looked nervous. Melissa, she barely looked me in the eye when she paid. I swear she even glanced over her shoulder a couple of times like she was checking to see if he was watching." Harris leaned forward now, his attention unwavering. And what about him, the man? Maggie's expression hardened slightly. He paid for his stuff separately, bought a big canvas bag, not one of the lightweight ones for camping, but one of those industrial bags people use for hauling tools or, I don't know, hunting equipment, paid cash, exact change, didn't say much except, keep the change. But here's the thing. She paused and wrung her hands nervously. When they left, they didn't leave together. He walked out first and then she followed a couple minutes later like she was trying not to be seen with him. Harris exchanged glances with Officer Mills, who had been silently listening nearby. Did you notice anything else, Maggie? Anything unusual about their interaction? Yeah, the way he looked at her, Maggie said after a brief silence. It wasn't friendly. If I had to describe it, I'd say it was possessive, controlling, like he had something over her, you know? Creepy as hell, Harris nodded. And did you see where they went after they left your store? Well, not exactly, she admitted. But a little while later I saw them again, or at least their cars. His truck, an older Chevy green paint with some rust around the wheel wells, he took off down the road leading to Red Cliff Trail. Her Subaru was with him at first, but somewhere along the way it turned off onto that smaller forest track, the one that's more of a dirt road than a real path. That's when I started feeling like something wasn't right. Harris jotted down the details. A green Chevy truck. You're sure it was headed toward Red Cliff? Absolutely sure, Maggie said, her voice heavy with conviction. I've lived in this town my whole life, I know where those roads lead. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping lightly against the edge of his notepad. Maggie, he said slowly, why didn't you come forward earlier? Her cheeks reddened slightly and her hands clenched the straps of her purse even tighter. I didn't think it was my business, she admitted. People go into the woods all the time, it didn't seem like murder, you know? But then I heard about the body, and I couldn't stop thinking about them, the way she looked, the way he looked at her. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Harris gave her a reassuring nod. You did the right thing by coming in, Maggie. This helps a lot. We'll look into the man you described, and his truck. It might not seem like much, but you just gave us a lead we didn't have before. As Maggie left the station that evening, Harris stood at the window, watching as her car disappeared into the falling snow. He didn't know who the hell the man with Melissa was, but one thing was certain, he wasn't just some passing stranger. And the way Maggie described him, Harris's gut told him that this man knew a lot more about what happened to Melissa than anyone else had so far admitted. Clues at the crime scene, traces of violence. The scene at Red Cliff Trail was a haunting blend of destruction and desperation, but as the blaze was extinguished and the smoke began to clear, dark whispers of what had truly transpired started to emerge through the ashes. For Sheriff Rich Harris, this wasn't just a routine crime scene. It was a puzzle where every misplaced log, every disturbed footprint, might hold an answer. Under the glow of flashlights, the frosted forest floor revealed a series of faint blood trails leading toward the charred remains. Officer Mills, crouching just a few feet away from the burn site, whistled low and slow as he brushed away a layer of snow with a gloved hand. This is blood, isn't it? He asked, his voice wavering between curiosity and unease. It's blood, all right, Harris muttered, his breath misting in the cold air. The bloodstains, though dulled and congealed from the freezing temperatures, were unmistakable. They formed a broken path, tracing back into the deeper woods. Looks like someone took their time dragging something, or someone, from further out, he observed grimly. The path of blood wasn't the only unsettling thing at the scene. A few yards away from the fire pit, a shovel lay half buried in the frozen earth, its handle splintered and blade coated in dirt and snow-spattered drops of crimson. Harris knelt beside it, running his fingers over the worn grip. The edge of the blade was dented as if it had struck something solid, something more resistant than soil. You don't just find a shovel like this lying around, he murmured. This was brought here for a reason. Mills stood back, squinting at the landscape. So they dug something up, or were trying to bury something, he speculated. Think they planned to bury her? Harris shook his head. No, not with a fire like that. That fire wasn't here to hide her body under the ground, he replied, gesturing toward the burned area. It was here to wipe her off the map. The forensics team, now arriving under the cover of the snowy night, began their careful excavation of the area. Technician Amanda Cole stood over the scene with a practiced eye, silently scanning every angle before pointing out another detail. Look here, she called, motioning for the sheriff. Footprints! Faint, but you can just barely make them out. Harris and Mills followed her indication, leaning down to inspect a pair of boot prints leading away from the site, heading toward a dense thicket of trees. The strange thing wasn't that they existed, but how hurried they looked. The snowy ground around the prints had melted slightly, likely from the heat of the fire distorting some details, but the shallow impressions were still visible. "Must have been in a rush," Harris said quietly. "Or spooked," Cole added. "Maybe they didn't think anyone would come out this far in the middle of winter, but something made them sloppy." Sloppy, but not careless. Harris spotted another anomaly amidst the chaos. Several cigarette butts scattered near the edge of the clearing, partially covered in snow. He crouched close enough to examine them without disturbing the scene. "Huh," he grunted. "Smoker's nerve, maybe? Can't set a body on fire without a few calming puffs?" Mills frowned. "Or maybe they were sitting here waiting, watching the fire burn until they thought it was safe to leave." The faint, acrid smell of gasoline still lingered in the air, growing stronger as the investigators moved closer to the burn site. It was subtle now, masked by the crispness of the winter night, but unmistakable. "They doused her with gas," Cole confirmed while taking samples from the scorched earth. "No signs of accelerants from anything natural. They went out of their way to make sure she burned fast." Harris's jaw tightened. "And yet they didn't stick around long enough to finish the job," he muttered under his breath. "The remains are still here. They didn't count on the fire fizzling out this quick in the snow." Nearby, Mills motioned Harris over to where something metallic gleamed faintly against the snowy forest floor. "Sheriff, over here. Found something else," Mills said, his voice a mix of hesitation and intrigue. Kneeling down, he picked up what turned out to be a small object, a silver pendant, slightly burned but mostly intact. The design was simple and unassuming, a small oak leaf hanging from a delicate chain. It didn't seem connected to any of the charred remains nearby, but Harris pocketed it anyway. "Might mean something later," he said. Further evidence of the violence became chillingly clear. About 10 feet deeper into the woods they found another macabre clue, marks carved into the trees. Large vertical scrapes on the bark, shallow but deliberate, formed a pattern that Cole identified as consistent with struggle or restraint. "If she was alive when she came into these woods," Cole theorized, pointing to the grooves, "these could have been where she fought back. But she was tied up, hands behind her back when she was found, right?" "Right," Harris confirmed. "So she fought as much as she could, but she didn't stand a chance." What painted the grimmest picture of all, however, was the sheer lack of personal items or belongings at the scene. Whoever did this had stripped Melissa of every marker of her identity before trying to destroy her, leaving behind only the gruesome remains the fire hadn't fully consumed. "It's like they wanted her erased completely," Harris said. "Not just dead, gone." Forensics would later confirm a disturbing fact. Melissa had sustained blunt force trauma to her skull before she was burned. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. Someone had struck her down, transported her here, and coldly tried to erase her from existence. "This was planned," Harris said as he stood over the scene, staring into the blackened remnants of the fire. "Calculated. They knew exactly where to go. These woods aren't easy to navigate, especially in the winter. Whoever did this knew the area." And then there was the question of the gasoline canister, a piece of evidence that had gone unnoticed in the initial chaos but was now found lying just a few yards away, hidden under a thin layer of snow. Harris bent down and studied the canister closely. It was dented and old, with faint fingerprints on its rusted surface. "They carried this here," he muttered, "and I bet you it didn't come from far away." The crime scene was a tableau of deliberate brutality. The blood trail, the shovel, the burns, the smoldering log pile. It all painted a picture of a darkness that no amount of snow could conceal. For Harris, standing amidst the winter silence, there was no doubt. This wasn't just a senseless act of violence. This was controlled, deliberate, and personal. Someone in Fox Hollow had more to lose than they wanted the world to know. A double crime. Envy and jealousy. As the case unraveled, one thing became increasingly clear. Melissa Miller's murder was no random act of violence. It was personal, intensely, deeply personal. The meticulous way her identity had been erased, the calculated nature of the crime, and the sheer vehemence of the execution pointed directly at someone who had more than just a passing grudge. And as Sheriff Rich Harris and his team dug deeper, they discovered that envy and jealousy can twist people in ways more terrifying than they ever imagined. The name Amanda Graves first emerged in a routine interview. A mutual acquaintance between Amanda and Melissa, a former classmate from the University of Northern Maine, casually mentioned Amanda during questioning. "I don't know if it means anything," the acquaintance had said, "but Amanda never really liked Melissa. I mean, she went out of her way not to talk about her, but you could tell there was bad blood. Next-level bad blood. From the outside, Amanda Graves seemed like the polar opposite of Melissa. Where Melissa was reserved and introspective, Amanda was vibrant, outspoken, and constantly surrounded by others. She was charismatic in a way that drew people to her, the type of person who made it seem like she had the perfect life. But beneath that veneer there was something darker. Amanda had been a fellow student at the same university as Melissa, attending some of the same environmental science classes in their early years. The two weren't exactly friends, but they shared social circles, just enough to know each other well. According to several classmates, the tension between them was palpable. Amanda was jealous of Melissa, one classmate revealed. Not just professionally because Melissa was good at her work, but personally too. There was this guy, Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter, already a central figure in the investigation, was more than just a wealthy landowner in Fox Hollow. He was the thread that bound Melissa's mysterious life to Amanda's growing resentment. By the time police uncovered Amanda's deeper connection to Daniel, the pieces began to fall into place. Amanda and Daniel had a history, a messy, complicated one. She had been involved with Daniel long before Melissa even entered the picture, and although it wasn't a conventional romance, Amanda had always thought she had his undivided attention. But 2 years before Melissa's death, things had changed. Daniel had grown increasingly distant with Amanda, preoccupied with his business, his estate, and, as it turned out, Melissa. Witnesses reported seeing Amanda at Daniel's estate on multiple occasions, often arguing with him or leaving in tears. Amanda thought she was his priority, a close friend told police, but when Melissa came along, I think she realized she wasn't, and I don't think Amanda could handle that. This jealousy festered over time, turning from frustration into full-blown hatred. Amanda became fixated on Melissa. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about everything Melissa represented. To Amanda, Melissa was the quiet, understated girl who seemed to effortlessly command attention while saying so little. She was the person Amanda desperately wanted to be, but couldn't. She hated Melissa, another friend confessed. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. Amanda thought Melissa had stolen her place, her life, her happiness. The turning point came 6 months before Melissa's murder. Text messages between Amanda and Daniel, uncovered by investigators, revealed intense, cryptic exchanges marked by rage and desperation. In one message, Amanda wrote, "You can't just toss me aside like this, not for her. I know things about you and maybe it's time the world found out." Another message sent weeks later read, "If you want me gone, you're going to have to finish the job yourself, because as long as she's around, I'm not going anywhere." But Daniel Carter wasn't exactly innocent in this situation, far from it. As investigators dug into his role in the crime, they found unsettling patterns of manipulation and control. Daniel was a man who wielded power not just with his money, but with his ability to exploit insecurities and vulnerabilities. Of all the young women who crossed through his life, Amanda had once been his favorite pawn, a willing participant in his games until Melissa became the apple of his eye. Though the messages painted Amanda as someone spiraling into darkness, they also suggested Daniel had played an active role in pushing her to the edge. Months before Melissa's death, friends observed a noticeable change in Amanda's behavior. She became erratic, fixated on petty slights that Melissa likely never knew existed. She started keeping tabs on her, one friend recalled. She knew where Melissa went, who she talked to. It was obsessive. This culminated in a chilling discovery in Amanda's apartment. Police seized a journal filled with scrawled angry entries that laid bare her emotions. The pages were riddled with obsessive, venomous thoughts about Melissa, with phrases like, "She doesn't deserve him, or his attention," and, "If she thinks she can take what's mine, she's wrong." But it wasn't just words. Amanda's journal contained something far more sinister: plans, detailed descriptions of how to catch Melissa alone, how to cover her tracks, and even a checklist of items: a shovel, gasoline, rope, all of which matched the tools used in Melissa's murder. During interrogation, Amanda initially denied everything. For hours she maintained her innocence, feigning shock at Melissa's death. But bit by bit, her composure crumbled under the weight of the evidence. When confronted with her journal, Amanda broke down, her carefully curated facade giving way to raw, unfiltered emotion. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. She ruined everything. If I couldn't have Daniel, then why should she? She didn't love him, not like I did." Her confession unraveled an even darker truth: Amanda hadn't acted alone. When pressed about logistics, Amanda admitted that Daniel knew what was going to happen. He hadn't stopped her. Worse, he'd actively encouraged it. even observing from a distance as the fire consumed Melissa's body. He said her death would solve everything," Amanda wept. "He told me it would be the end, and I believed him." The revelation sent shockwaves through Fox Hollow. The idea that a respected figure like Daniel Carter could be complicit in such a crime shattered the town's already fragile sense of security. It wasn't just Amanda's jealousy that had killed Melissa. It was Daniel's calculated indifference, his willingness to let jealousy become a weapon in the hands of someone as unhinged as Amanda. By the time both Amanda and Daniel were arrested, the town was left grappling with the fallout of their tangled web of envy, power, and betrayal. Melissa's murder was no longer a standalone act of violence. It was the climax of a toxic cycle fueled by pride, resentment, and the dark allure of control. The secret life of Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter was an enigma, and in many ways that was by design. At 45 years old, Daniel had managed to carve out a life shrouded in mystery, a reclusive figure of Fox Hollow, who wielded quiet power from his sprawling estate on the town's eastern edge. To some, he was a successful businessman, overseeing a portfolio of properties and investments that stretched far beyond the quiet town of Fox Hollow. To others, he was little more than a shadow, a man content to live in isolation, untouchable and unknowable. But as the investigation into Melissa Miller's death unfolded, so too did Daniel Carter's carefully buried secrets. Locals didn't see much of Daniel. He rarely visited town unless absolutely necessary. On the rare occasion he did show up, it would be to meet with one of his lawyers or board members at the local diner, drawing curious gazes from patrons too intimidated to approach him but too interested to look away. With his clean-cut appearance, sharp-featured face, and seemingly endless supply of tailored coats, Daniel exuded an aura of control. Yet for all his polish, Daniel Carter was more myth than man in Fox Hollow. "It's funny," recalled one diner waitress. "You'd think for someone with all that money he'd be flashy, but he wasn't. He didn't need to be. He could walk into any room, say almost nothing, and people would just fall in line. If he smiled at you, you'd swear you'd been given a gift. But more often than not, he didn't smile." Daniel's wealth was the topic of constant speculation in Fox Hollow, largely because no one could quite pinpoint where it came from. His family, the Carters, were old money, one of those dynastic New England families with roots spreading back to the colonial era. But by the time Daniel inherited the family estate in Fox Hollow, it was said to be more of a burden than a blessing. The estate, with its sprawling 200 acres of dense forest, dilapidated outbuildings, and crumbling main house, was more a relic of a bygone era than a livable property. But Daniel was nothing if not resourceful. Over the years he restored the estate using funds from unknown sources and turned it into a symbol of quiet wealth. Visitors rarely came, and Daniel was said to have a preference for solitude, though it became apparent that his life behind closed doors was far more complex than anyone realized. As the police dug into Daniel's background, they uncovered a string of questionable dealings. His investments, while diverse and technically above board, often involved associates who were known for their less-than-ethical approaches to business. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and lucrative land deals all peppered his financial history. One investigator noted, "If Daniel Carter wasn't directly doing something illegal, he sure as hell was standing close to the people who were." But Daniel's secrets weren't limited to his financial dealings. They extended to his personal life. Though he projected the image of a composed and solitary man, Daniel had a reputation for forming complicated relationships with young women who seemed to fall under his spell. These relationships, described as mentorships by Daniel's few confidants, took on a different implication as evidence mounted in Melissa Miller's case. Melissa wasn't the first young woman to find herself tied up in Daniel's world. For years Daniel had been quietly inviting women to his estate, students from nearby universities, artists seeking inspiration in Maine's wilderness, or simply women who seemed drawn to his charm. These women, mostly in their 20s, would stay for days or weeks at a time, leaving with vague assurances of having worked on projects or received guidance from the enigmatic landowner. Most refused to speak ill of him, but few would go into detail about the nature of their time with Daniel. What exactly he offered them, mentorship, employment, friendship, or something more ominous, remained unclear. "Daniel had this way about him," admitted one former guest, a graduate student who had stayed at his estate over a summer studying local flora. "He made you feel special, like you were the only person in the world he really cared about, but then, when it was over, it was just over. You'd get a polite nod, maybe a check to fund your next project, and that was it. It was like you never existed." For Melissa, her connection to Daniel went deeper than most. journal entries and text messages revealed a complicated and sometimes tense relationship between the two. While Melissa's friends described her as fiercely independent and unlikely to be taken in by someone like Daniel, there were signs that she had fallen under his influence. Investigators uncovered messages where Melissa seemed to grapple with feelings of frustration and loyalty toward Daniel. In one text she wrote, "You say you care but you won't tell me the truth. Why am I even here?" Another message read, "If I do this for you, I need to know it'll be worth it. I need to know you're being honest with me." Daniel, for his part, denied any wrongdoing when questioned. Always calm, even under the weight of suspicion, he painted himself as a concerned mentor who merely wanted to help Melissa achieve her goals. "She was a brilliant young woman," he told police. "Driven, passionate. If I'd known she was in trouble, I would have done anything to help her." But his detached demeanor and polished words stood in stark contrast to the evidence mounting against him. Witnesses reported arguments between Daniel and Melissa in the weeks leading up to her murder, with some suggesting he had grown frustrated with her persistence in asking questions about his business dealings and hidden connections to the land around Fox Hollow. "She was poking around where she shouldn't have been," said one anonymous source who had worked for Daniel for years. "Daniel doesn't like it when people start looking too closely." As more details about his relationship with Amanda Graves came to light, Daniel's carefully maintained image began to crumble. Amanda, who had been romantically involved with Daniel for several years before Melissa entered the picture, had started to believe she was indispensable to him. But Daniel had a pattern of discarding people when they outlived their usefulness, and Amanda was no exception. According to Amanda's confession, Daniel played a far bigger role in Melissa's death than he let on. While Amanda had been consumed by jealousy and rage, Daniel had been the one to manipulate those emotions and channel them into action. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Amanda told police. "He told me, if we got rid of her, everything would go back to how it was. He said she was a problem for both of us." The investigators found chilling evidence to support Amanda's claim. Surveillance footage from a nearby highway showed Daniel's car entering the area near Red Cliff Trail the same night Melissa's body was burned. GPS data from Amanda's phone placed her at his estate just before the crime, and text messages revealed Daniel giving her instructions on how to take care of things. Fox Hollow had always been a quiet town, but the revelations about Daniel Carter shattered the illusion of peace. In a place where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, it turned out that the man on the hill, wealthy, poised, and untouchable, had been playing a long and dangerous game. For Daniel, power wasn't just about money, it was about control, of people, of perceptions, and ultimately of the truth. The cracks in his facade, however, were finally starting to show. Revealing the confession, murder, driven by unrequited love. Amanda Graves sat in the interrogation room, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as though she were holding herself together. She avoided direct eye contact with anyone in the room, her lips pressed thin while the two detectives, Sheriff Rich Harris and his junior, Officer Mills, sat across from her. On the cold steel table between them lay a leather-bound journal, its pages curled slightly, its spine worn from heavy use. The journal was filled with Amanda's dark, twisted thoughts that ultimately cracked the case wide open. For hours Amanda had remained defiant, claiming innocence and feigning ignorance about Melissa Miller's death. But Harris, a man known for his quiet persistence, didn't buy it for a second. "Amanda," he began, leaning forward in his chair, "you're a smart person. You've got to know how this looks, right? The journal, the texts, everything. We're not here to guess whether you were involved. We already know. What we need to know now is why." Amanda's eyes flickered briefly toward the journal on the table, but she quickly snapped her focus back to the wall behind the detectives. "I didn't kill anyone," she said, her voice tight and defensive. "I don't even know what you're talking about." Harris exhaled through his nose, keeping his expression calm. He had seen this before. People digging their heels into a lie they thought they could live inside of forever. But what Amanda didn't know was that the evidence was overwhelming, and the detectives weren't about to let her wriggle loose. After another tense few moments of silence, Harris flipped open the journal and began to read. "Page 47, he said, pausing as he thumbed through the entries. "Here we go. If she thinks she can take what's mine, she's wrong." He slid the open journal across the table toward Amanda. "That's your handwriting, isn't it?" Amanda's jaw clenched, and her hands balled into fists on her lap, but she still said nothing. It was Mills who broke the quiet, his voice softer but no less firm. "Amanda, the rope, the gasoline, the fire at Red Cliff Trail, it all came straight from this journal. You planned this. You wrote it all down step by step. We don't just have evidence, we have your own words." At that, Amanda's carefully maintained composure started to crack. Her breaths came faster, her cheeks flushed, and her gaze dropped to the table. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she muttered weakly, barely above a whisper. Harris pounced on the admission, his voice firm but lacking harshness. "Didn't mean for what to happen, Amanda. Tell us what you mean." She looked up then, her eyes brimming with tears. For a moment she seemed small, less like the calculating, envious murderer the town had imagined, and more like someone who had been lost inside her own mind for far too long. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." "And yet it did," Harris pressed gently. "Melissa is dead, Amanda, and you know why that is. I think you've been holding on to this for too long. It's eating you alive, isn't it?" Amanda's shoulders slumped and the tears started rolling down her cheeks. "She ruined everything," she hissed through clenched teeth, her sorrow quickly flipping to anger. "She waltzed in like she was better than everyone, better than me. She didn't belong in his life." "She didn't belong in my life." "Whose life are we talking about?" Mills asked calmly, though they both knew the answer. "Daniel," Amanda spat, almost snarling the name. "It was always about Daniel. She didn't deserve him, not after all I had done for him. The late nights, She shook her head, her rage giving way to a kind of pitiful weariness. "I loved him, okay? I gave him everything I had, and it still wasn't enough." Harris let her words hang in the air for a moment before he spoke again. "And Melissa," he said carefully, "what did she take from you, Amanda?" "She took him!" Amanda cried, her voice rising until it cracked under the weight of her emotions. "Daniel stopped calling, stopped looking at me the way he used to. All he ever talked about was her, Melissa this, Melissa that. She didn't even care about him the way I did. She didn't love him, not like me." "And that's why you decided to get rid of her?" Harris prompted, his tone steady, controlled. Amanda nodded, defeated. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hollow. "I thought, if she were gone, things could go back to the way they were. I thought Daniel would see me again." It was Mills who asked the question that had been lingering in both of their minds. "And what about Daniel? Did he know?" Amanda's head shot up, her tear-streaked face suddenly animated with panic. No, not at first." She hesitated, guilt swimming in her eyes. "But later, when it was too late, he helped. He said this was how it had to be, that her death would solve everything." "So Daniel knew?" Harris pressed. "Yes," Amanda whispered. "He knew." Harris sat back in his chair, processing her confession. Amanda's jealousy, her obsession, had consumed her completely, and Daniel, the polished, untouchable man on the hill, had used that obsession to his advantage. It wasn't Amanda alone who had taken Melissa's life. It had been a partnership, driven by envy, manipulation, and the kind of twisted love that destroys everyone it touches. Amanda wiped at her face with trembling hands, leaning forward as though her confession had physically exhausted her. "I didn't want to kill her," she said weakly. I just didn't want to lose him." Harris watched her for a long moment before rising from his chair. "Amanda Graves," he said, his voice solemn, "you're under arrest for the murder of Melissa Miller." There was no explosion of anger, no sudden outburst of self-pity. Amanda simply nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as her hands were cuffed and she was led out of the interrogation room. For better or worse, the weight of her confession seemed to have lifted something off her shoulders, even if it had cost her freedom. Harris remained in the room, staring down at the journal still open on the table. The hatred, the obsession, the uncontrollable envy that spilled across its pages chilled him to his core. It was a sobering reminder that sometimes love is no less dangerous than hatred when twisted into something unrecognizable. As he closed the journal and stepped back into the snowy night outside the station, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this confession was only the beginning. Daniel Carter was still out there, his role in Melissa's murder shrouded in cold, calculated silence, and Harris knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Daniel wasn't the kind of man to go down easily. The unlikely accomplice, Daniel's role in the cover-up. It wasn't until Amanda finally began to talk that the investigation took its darkest turn yet, one that led straight back to Daniel Carter. The polished, enigmatic landowner who had stood at the edges of the investigation seemingly too aloof to be involved, suddenly became a central figure. As Amanda unraveled her twisted feelings for Daniel, she also revealed the shocking extent of his involvement. Sitting in his office at the Fox Hollow Sheriff's Station, Sheriff Rich Harris reviewed pieces of damning evidence, a heaviness settling over him like a weight that refused to lift. Amanda had confirmed that she and Daniel had been in communication before, during, and after Melissa's death, and if what she said was true, Daniel wasn't just aware of what was happening, he had encouraged it. A week earlier, Harris had thought Daniel was simply an arrogant, wealthy man on the periphery of a jealous woman's murderous rage, but now, the truth looked far worse. 3 months ago, Amanda's voice was trembling during her latest interrogation, her fingers fidgeting with the handcuffs around her wrists. She couldn't meet Harris's cold, focused gaze. Daniel acted like he was done with me. He wouldn't return my calls, wouldn't let me near him, nothing. I felt like he was slipping away. And I knew it was because of her. Melissa. Harris raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly over the interrogation table. And what did Daniel say to you, Amanda? Did he ever explicitly tell you to harm Melissa? Amanda hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. Not at first. No, he acted like he didn't care, like none of it mattered. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. But then one night when I finally confronted him, he said it would all go away if she wasn't around anymore. Harris exchanged a glance with Officer Mills, who stood with his arms crossed in the corner of the room. Mills's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you mean, Amanda? Did Daniel tell you to kill her? Amanda's lips trembled, her eyes darting toward the menacing journal that sat on the table, the same journal that had sealed her fate. He didn't say it outright, she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. But he planted the idea. He said that she was a problem not just for him but for us. Her voice rose slightly, becoming desperate. He said we could go back to how things were if she wasn't in the picture anymore. Harris's tone grew sharp. Planted the idea? Amanda, that's not vague. That's direct encouragement. Did he give you instructions? Was the fire his idea? Her breath hitched, and for a moment it looked as though she might push the blame entirely onto Daniel. But instead she shook her head violently. No, the fire was mine, she shouted. I swear! I just thought, if there was no proof, no trail leading back to me, Daniel wouldn't. He wouldn't. Her words trailed off, the confession consuming her as she realized she was just as implicated as Daniel. For Harris and his team, this was enough to turn the spotlight on Daniel Carter. The next step was catching him in lies, a task Daniel didn't make easy. When Harris and Mills arrived at his sprawling estate to ask a few more questions, Daniel greeted them like he had nothing to hide. Sheriff Harris, Daniel said smoothly, his deep voice cutting through the cold evening air. He stood at the entrance of his home, dressed impeccably as ever, an expensive watch glittering on his wrist. To what do I owe the pleasure? I assume this is about Melissa Miller? It is, Harris replied, his tone even but his eyes sharp. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. We've uncovered new information, Mr. Carter. I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Daniel gestured them inside with a smirk that bordered on condescension. The warmth of the estate's interior was in sharp contrast to Harris's frigid demeanor. Of course, Daniel said coolly. I want to do whatever I can to help. He settled into a leather chair, his every move measured and controlled. Harris looked him dead in the eye. Do you know Amanda Graves? Daniel barely blinked. I do, he said casually. She confided in me about her feelings for Melissa. A complicated young woman, that Amanda. And these feelings, Harris leaned forward, studying Daniel's reaction closely. Did she ever tell you what she planned to do about them? Daniel tilted his head slightly, his face betraying nothing. I can't say she did, he said calmly. Amanda was emotional, erratic even, but I assumed anything she said was just venting. It's not my place to intervene in every little drama that occurs in Fox Hollow. Mills spoke for the first time, his voice cutting into the room like a razor. Did you know Amanda had been texting you about Melissa in the weeks leading up to her murder, and that those texts referred to getting rid of her? Daniel's jaw tightened ever so slightly, the first crack in his performance. I don't recall any such messages, he said calmly, and if they exist, you're more than welcome to share them. I can assure you I never encouraged Amanda to do anything violent. But Daniel's calm facade didn't last. When Harris and Mills presented the physical evidence, GPS data placing Daniel's car near the trail the night of Melissa's murder, surveillance footage showing Amanda entering his home hours before the crime, and damning text exchanges, it became clear his airtight story was starting to unravel. What exactly were you doing near Red Cliff Trail, Mr. Carter? Harris asked, his voice cold, cutting. Daniel leaned back in his chair, an air of controlled indifference on the surface, but unease flickering behind his eyes. I was driving, thinking. The woods are peaceful at night, he said. It was a weak excuse, one he clearly knew wouldn't hold up. Right around the same time Melissa's body was burned, Mills added, his voice edged with challenge. Peaceful, huh? Daniel's calm demeanor finally broke. He exhaled sharply, his irritation spilling over. Yes, he snapped, I was there, but it doesn't mean I killed her. I didn't put my hands on Melissa. Whatever Amanda did, she acted on her own. And yet you knew it was happening, Harris countered, his voice gravelly with restrained anger. You knew, and you didn't stop her. In fact, you told her Melissa was a problem for both of you. Daniel opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, Daniel Carter, untouchable, unshakable Daniel Carter, looked cornered. 3 days later, he was formally arrested. The charges weren't for murder, but for conspiracy to cover it up. For aiding Amanda Graves in destroying evidence, for manipulating her jealousy to suit his needs, and for standing by as the sick plan unfolded. The town of Fox Hollow, stunned by his arrest, was left in disbelief. How could a man like Daniel, with his wealth, power, and influence, fall so far? But for Sheriff Harris, the answer was simple. When you live a life built on control, you always underestimate the moment it turns against you. Harris looked at Daniel one last time as the man was led out of his estate in handcuffs, his tailored coat flapping in the winter wind. Standing tall, his face devoid of any expression, Daniel didn't say a single word. But Harris knew Daniel wasn't truly defeated, not yet. Men like him don't go down easily, Harris muttered to Mills afterward. He's been playing a long game. It's going to take everything we've got to make it stick. The dramatic trial, Amanda and Daniel face justice. The trial of Amanda Graves and Daniel Carter was the biggest spectacle Fox Hollow, and for that matter, the entire state of Maine, had seen in decades. Reporters from across the country descended on the small town, turning the courthouse into a media circus. Every detail of the case, from Amanda's shattered confession to Daniel's icy demeanor, was dissected by journalists and television pundits. For weeks, the story dominated the airwaves. Double lives and deadly secrets, the murder of Melissa Miller, betrayal in the woods of Fox Hollow. Inside the packed courtroom, the tension was palpable. Families of both the victim and the defendants sat in grim silence while members of the public whispered among themselves. Cameras weren't allowed in the room, but reporters lined the courthouse steps, their pens poised for any tidbit of drama. And there was plenty of drama. Opening statements, the prosecution sets the tone. The prosecution painted a harrowing picture of betrayal, jealousy, and manipulation. Lead prosecutor Emily Shaw, a sharp and seasoned lawyer, stood before the jury on the first day of proceedings and wasted no time driving home the gravity of the crime. This case isn't just about the murder of Melissa Miller, Shaw began, her tone unwavering. It's about power, control, and the devastating lengths people will go to protect their secrets. The evidence will show that Amanda Graves acted out of jealousy, yes, but she wasn't alone. Daniel Carter, a man of immense wealth and influence, played a pivotal role in this heinous act. Together, they conspired not just to take a life, but to erase it. Shaw highlighted key evidence from Amanda's journal outlining her plans to Daniel's incriminating text messages and GPS data. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, she concluded. This was calculated, premeditated, and both of them are responsible. Amanda's defense, a story of manipulation. When it was Amanda's defense team's turn, they tried to shift the narrative. Her lawyer, Lawrence Price, emphasized her emotional instability and claimed that she had been manipulated by Daniel Carter's cold, calculated influence. Amanda Graves is not a cold-blooded killer. She is a heartbroken, vulnerable young woman who fell prey to the control of a man she trusted, Price argued, his voice heavy with sympathy. Yes, Amanda made mistakes, grave ones. No one is denying that. But the larger story here is Daniel Carter's ability to twist people to his will. He exploited Amanda's emotions, used her love for him as a weapon, and left her to carry the weight of this crime. Price's strategy was clear, to portray Amanda as a victim herself. Witnesses, including Amanda's friends, took the stand to describe how her relationship with Daniel had consumed her. She used to be fun, full of energy, one friend testified tearfully. But after Daniel, it was like he broke her. She was obsessed, but also terrified of disappointing him. But the prosecution quickly countered, arguing that Amanda was fully aware of her actions. Obsession doesn't excuse a crime, Emily Shaw stressed during cross-examination. We're here because Amanda didn't just dream of hurting Melissa, she acted on it. Daniel's defense, the stone wall. If Amanda's defense was emotional, Daniel's was ice cold. His high-powered lawyer, Jack Creighton, leaned heavily on Daniel's reputation as a respected businessman. Creighton claimed there was no hard evidence linking his client to Melissa's murder, portraying Daniel as a scapegoat for Amanda's unstable actions. "My client has been dragged into this because of baseless assumptions," Creighton declared, his voice smooth and confident. "Mr. Carter did not direct Amanda Graves to harm Melissa Miller. He had no knowledge of her plans. The only crime committed here is the destruction of Daniel Carter's good name." Daniel himself maintained a calm, detached presence throughout the trial. When he took the stand, he was poised and articulate, presenting himself not as a co-conspirator but as a man blindsided by Amanda's actions. "Amanda was emotional and erratic," he said, his tone measured, "but I never believed she would do something like this. If I had known, I would have stopped her." It was a performance and everyone in the courtroom knew it, but his calculated demeanor wasn't enough to explain away the phone records, GPS data, and chilling text messages that suggested he had more involvement than he let on. The prosecution hammered him during cross-examination. "You knew she was jealous of Melissa," Shaw said sharply, "and yet you did nothing to stop her. Why is that, Mr. Carter?" "I didn't take her seriously," Daniel replied with a faint shrug. "People say things in the heat of the moment. I assumed it was all talk." "Talk doesn't burn a body, Mr. Carter," Shaw fired back, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "You told Amanda that Melissa was a problem for both of you. Did you not?" Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second. But the damage was done. That hesitation spoke louder than his denial ever could. Testimonies and revelations. The most gripping moments of the trial came from witnesses. Amanda's tearful testimony was equal parts confession and accusation. "I loved him," she sobbed on the stand. "I thought, if she was gone, everything would go back to the way it was. But Daniel, he told me it was the only way. He said it would fix everything." Daniel's lawyer immediately objected, calling Amanda's statements self-serving delusions, but the jury watched her break down with grim attention. Was she telling the whole truth, or was she desperate to drag Daniel down with her? Either way, her words painted a picture of a relationship built on manipulation, obsession, and destruction. The prosecution also presented damning evidence. Phone records showing Daniel's messages to Amanda, surveillance footage of his car near the trail, and forensic analysis tying him to the gasoline canister found at the scene. Each piece added weight to the case against him. The verdict. After weeks of tense arguments and emotional testimonies, the jury finally reached its decision. For Amanda, the verdict was swift and unrelenting, guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her face crumpled as the judge delivered the sentence, but there was no protest. It was as if she knew this was where her obsession with Daniel would inevitably lead her. For Daniel, the outcome was less definitive, but no less damning. While he was acquitted of direct involvement in Melissa's murder, the jury found him guilty of conspiracy to cover up the crime. He received a 25-year prison sentence, a stunning downfall for a man who had once seemed untouchable. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. Melissa's parents held each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. For them, no verdict could bring their daughter back, but at least justice had been served. Across the room, Daniel's icy composure cracked for the first time. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Amanda, sitting just a few feet away, didn't even glance at him. The fallout. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy reached its peak. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and families tried to shield themselves from the chaos. Fox Hollow, once a quiet, forgotten town, now stood as a symbol of jealousy, power, and tragedy. For Sheriff Harris, who had been there since the first night at the crime scene, the verdict was bittersweet. "We got justice for Melissa," he told reporters. "But this case is a reminder that crimes like these don't just happen in big cities, they can happen anywhere, even in a town like ours." And with that, the trial that had consumed the nation came to an end. But for those closest to it, for Melissa's family, for Amanda behind bars, and for Daniel in his cold prison cell, the story was far from over. The fallout of hatred and deep wounds. The trial of Amanda Graves and Daniel Carter may have concluded with verdicts and sentences, but the ripple effects of the crime left Fox Hollow and its residents reeling for years. The town, once a quiet place where everybody knew their neighbors and where life moved at an unhurried pace, was now marked by whispers of betrayal, tragedy, and deep scars. The murder of Melissa Miller and the subsequent revelations of deceit, jealousy, and power had unraveled the fragile tapestry that held the community together. The fallout, both personal and communal, was devastating. Melissa's family, a pain that never goes away. For Susan and Tom Miller, Melissa's parents, life after the trial became a quiet, endless ache. The joy they once found in their daughter's adventurous spirit, the stories of her wildlife research, the photographs she so proudly showed them, and the phone calls just to check in, had been replaced by an overwhelming vacuum. Melissa wasn't just their daughter, she had been their pride, their light, the representation of everything good they had given to the world. After the verdict was delivered, Susan Miller stood outside the courthouse, clutching her husband's arm as reporters swarmed them for comments. Her voice cracked with every word. "Justice doesn't bring our Melissa back," she said softly. "No parent should ever have to bury their child, especially not like this. I hope everyone remembers her for the beautiful soul she was, not for what happened to her. She deserved so much more." Following the trial, the Millers relocated out of state. Staying in Maine, let alone anywhere near Fox Hollow, felt unbearable. The forested roads, the small towns Melissa had adored, now only carried painful reminders of her absence. They packed up their lives along with every photograph and memento of Melissa and moved to Colorado, where fewer memories lingered in the landscape. But while the physical distance helped, the emotional wounds never fully healed. Tom Miller took up carpentry in his retirement, building handcrafted furniture he quietly donated to local charities in Melissa's name. Susan threw herself into advocacy, working with organizations that provided support to families of violent crime victims. At every event she attended, she carried a locket with Melissa's picture, touching it softly whenever she spoke. "Grief doesn't end," she often told others who sought comfort, "but neither does love." Fox Hollow, the quiet town, with a dark shadow. Long after the trial ended, Fox Hollow carried the weight of the crime like a permanent scar. Few townspeople felt comfortable speaking openly about what had happened, yet the whispers persisted in every corner, at the diner, in the general store, and even in the pews of the local church. It didn't help that Fox Hollow's name had been splattered across national headlines as the town at the center of a chilling tale of murder and manipulation. Outsiders now saw Fox Hollow not as the charming, sleepy town it once was, but as the site of one of Maine's darkest stories. Businesses had a hard time recovering from the unwanted attention. Tourists who once passed through during fall foliage season began avoiding Fox Hollow altogether, preferring to steer clear of a place that now felt more eerie than quaint. Marge Porter, who owned the town's small general store, described the lasting impact during a local interview. "People used to come in and ask us about fishing spots or hiking trails," she said. "Now all they want to know is, where's the trail where the murder happened? We don't need that kind of curiosity." Even locals began looking at each other differently. There was a shared unease, a constant undercurrent of distrust that hadn't existed before. "The thing about a crime like this," remarked Sheriff Harris during a town meeting months after the verdict, "is that it doesn't just hurt the people involved, it hurts all of us together. It makes us question what kind of neighbors we really are." Harris himself carried the weight of the case long after the trial. While he felt some pride at having brought Amanda and Daniel to justice, the scenes from the Red Cliff Trail haunted him every night. The smell of the burned remains, the smoldering fire, Amanda's broken confession, it all stayed with him, echoing in quiet moments of his life. "When you're a sheriff," he later explained in a rare television interview, "people think you're used to bad things, but a crime like this, it changes you. Even when you're off duty, it follows you home." Daniel Carter, the fall of a powerful man. For Daniel Carter, prison life was an undeniable contrast to the wealth and privilege he had once enjoyed. The man who had once commanded rooms with his quiet authority, who had manipulated emotions and controlled narratives with ease, now found himself in a space where none of his influence carried weight. Stripped of his tailored suits and pristine reputation, Daniel became just another inmate in the eyes of the system. Inside the prison walls, Daniel's story followed him. The other inmates knew who he was, and while some treated him as nothing more than a curiosity, others approached him as the perfect target of resentment and disdain. "He played God out there," one inmate later claimed during an interview with a local reporter. "But in here, he's just another man trying not to get crushed." Despite his circumstances, Daniel remained defiant to the end. "I shouldn't even be here," he wrote in a letter to his lawyer 9 months into his sentence. "I was convicted because of public opinion, not evidence. These people don't understand the world I lived in, or the decisions it required." But even as he clung to his narrative of innocence, cracks began to emerge in his resolve. Former prison guards revealed that Daniel often spent hours in solitary reflection, pacing his cell with an air no longer of control but of exhaustion. "You could tell," one guard said, "the man was unraveling, slowly but surely." Amanda Graves, a life wasted by obsession. Amanda Graves would spend the rest of her life in prison, but she didn't fight it. In fact, during her first parole hearing held years after her conviction, Amanda refused to even attempt to speak on her behalf. "I don't deserve another chance," she confessed to the board. "I took away a life, and for what? Some stupid idea of what I thought love was. I have to live with that every day." Her time in prison was marked by isolation. Once a charismatic and social personality, Amanda withdrew completely from social interaction. She avoided chapel services, rarely participated in any group activities, and even turned down the chance to learn prison trades like tailoring or cooking. Most of her days were spent staring out the window of her cell, lost in thought. She kept no photos of her family or past life, refusing to revisit the person she once was. On one occasion, an inmate claimed she'd heard Amanda murmuring to herself in her cell. When asked what she was saying, Amanda replied softly, "I see her in my dreams, Melissa. Sometimes she's smiling because she doesn't know, and sometimes she's screaming." A lesson in tragedy. The murder of Melissa Miller wasn't just a crime, it was a tragedy that echoed far beyond the lives it directly touched. It was a brutal reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions, of jealousy allowed to fester, and of power wielded irresponsibly. It destroyed families, uprooted lives, and left scars that would never fully heal. At a town meeting years later, Sheriff Harris spoke about the impact of the crime on Fox Hollow. "We'll never fully move past this," he admitted, "but we can learn from it. We can remember Melissa, not for how she died but for how she lived, her spirit, her passion, her kindness. Let that be her legacy, not what was taken from her." Fox Hollow would never be the same. Some scars run too deep, but for Melissa's family, for those who loved her, and for the community trying to heal, there was a quiet hope that, over time, the town could reclaim itself, not as a place of tragedy, but as a place of resilience and remembrance. The message left behind, the burden of mistakes. In the wake of the trial and the years that followed, the story of Melissa Miller, Amanda Graves, and Daniel Carter became more than just a tale of tragedy. It became a cautionary narrative, whispered in hushed conversations in classrooms, shared at family dining tables, and even studied in college psychology and sociology courses. If there was one thing the case had taught the world, it was the insidious and devastating weight of mistakes left unchecked. Mistakes born out of jealousy, unchecked ambition, manipulation, and love twisted into obsession. But what was the takeaway from a story like this? Could there even be a silver lining to a chain of events that left broken lives and shattered trust behind? The community of Fox Hollow, along with Melissa's family, Amanda, and even Daniel in his prison cell, grappled with these questions for years. The heavy toll of one act. The murder of Melissa Miller wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a domino effect. It showcased how a single misguided decision ripples far beyond the people directly involved. A crime driven by human weaknesses, envy, obsession, and control, had bled into the lives of strangers who would never forget the story. For Susan Miller, Melissa's mother, the simplicity of her daughter's life stood in stark contrast to the weight of her death. "Melissa was the kind of person you don't notice at first but can't forget once you do," Susan said in one of her public speaking engagements years later. "She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, her life didn't make headlines while she was alive, and yet it's her death that reminds us how cruelly fragile life can be when we let hatred and pride win." Tom Miller echoed his wife's thoughts at another event, but with a sharper, more haunting tone. "You spend your entire life raising a child, giving them the tools to live in this world, only for someone else's choices to undo it in a single moment," he said. "The greatest tragedy isn't just that Melissa was taken, it's that the people who took her never truly understood the consequences of their own actions. They were so blinded by their own struggles, their need to overcome their pain, that they made everyone around them suffer instead. The unseen consequences of jealousy and power." At the heart of the case was a message about unchecked emotions, how jealousy, when left to fester, can erode even the most rational of minds. Amanda Graves, once vibrant and successful in her own right, had allowed her envy of a woman she couldn't understand, and her desire for the affections of a man she couldn't control, to consume her. Her choices had destroyed Melissa's future, her own life, and Daniel's along with it. "Jealousy has teeth," Amanda once wrote in a letter she sent to her state-appointed prison counselor a year into her sentence. "It doesn't bite all at once, it's slow, deliberate. It chews away at every good part of you. By the time I knew what I was doing, there was nothing left of who I used to be. Amanda's story became a warning, a reminder of how dangerous unaddressed insecurities and mismanaged emotions can be. Her descent into darkness was a gradual erasure of who she had been, and despite her remorse after the fact, she admitted to herself and to others that the choices she made were her own. And then there was Daniel Carter, a man who had built a life of power, influence, and mystique, only to have it collapse under the weight of his arrogance and cruelty. Daniel's greatest sin wasn't murder, it was apathy. He had the ability to stop the tragic domino effect that unfolded. He had control over Amanda and a chance to diffuse her jealousy, but instead he manipulated her feelings for his own comfort and ambition. He chose indifference when faced with emotions he considered beneath him, and in doing so, he had fed the very obsession that caused Melissa's death. Sheriff Harris summed it up best years later during a memorial for Melissa. To look the other way when you know you can make a difference is to become responsible for the consequences. Daniel Carter didn't just fail Amanda, he failed Melissa, and he failed his own humanity. Fox Hollow reflects. As the years went by, the people of Fox Hollow began to turn their tragedy into a collective reflection. Community leaders organized town hall meetings centered on emotional resilience and mediation. "We've got to look after each other better," Marge Porter, a lifelong resident, said during one such meeting. "We've all got this habit of sweeping things under the rug. We pretend like we don't see someone struggling or hurting, like we don't hear the fights our neighbors are too ashamed to talk about, but it's on all of us to change that." The town also took steps to reclaim its identity. Red Cliff Trail, once avoided out of fear and superstition, was reopened after a community effort cleaned up the area. A bench was placed near the trailhead engraved with Melissa's name and a simple message. "She admired the beauty of the woods. Let her memory bloom here." Melissa's legacy, a call for kindness. Perhaps the most profound message left behind came not from Amanda's regret, Daniel's failure, or even the trial itself, but from Melissa's life. In her quiet way, Melissa had lived a life full of small kindnesses that left an impression on those who knew her. Former professors wrote essays about her curiosity and brilliance, while her family turned their grief into action by founding the Melissa Miller Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting environmental science students and preserving natural spaces like the ones Melissa had loved. Each year, the foundation awards scholarships to students faced with adversity, those who, as Susan Miller would say, have every reason to give up but keep going anyway, just like Melissa. The hard lesson. The story of Melissa Miller taught one undeniable truth. Mistakes, whether driven by hatred, love, or indifference, have consequences. They ripple through the lives of those left behind, creating waves that can carry pain or occasionally purpose. Amanda, Daniel, and even Melissa's family carried the weight of those ripples in different ways. In Daniel's final letter to his lawyer, written a year before his death in prison, he seemed to acknowledge his role in the tragedy. "I didn't light the fire," he wrote, "but I stood there and let it burn. I'm not sure that makes me any better." But for Melissa's family, focusing on blame was never the ultimate goal. They remained steadfast in their commitment to honoring their daughter's spirit, not her death. In one speech at a vigil held in Melissa's honor, Susan Miller made this clear. Standing in front of dozens of flickering candles and a crowd of mourners, she said, "It's easy to ask why. Why did this happen? Why couldn't it have been stopped? But asking why won't change what happened. What we can do is focus on the what now. What are we going to do to prevent the next family, the next town, from going through what we've endured? What will we do to make sure Melissa's kindness, her courage, her love of this world doesn't stop here?" A final reflection. In the end, Fox Hollow's story became one of resilience, not because the scars faded but because the town found ways to grow around them. Melissa's name was forever tied to tragedy, but her legacy blossomed into a symbol of compassion and determination. People learned to have hard conversations, confront their emotions, and reach out to one another before jealousy and hatred could take root. The burden of mistakes, the ripples of one woman's obsession, one man's indifference, would never entirely fade, but amidst the pain, Fox Hollow built something new, a community determined to face the darkness and honor the light.